Słuchasz podcastu Angielski z Konradem. Jeśli chcesz popracować nad płynnością, nabrać odwagi do konwersacji, skorygować często popełniane błędy bądź poznać skuteczne metody nauki, ta audycja jest dla Ciebie. Remember, you're not at school, so chill out, kick back and enjoy yourself. Let's begin. Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Angielski z Konradem. I hope you are well, ready and willing to learn. Enjoy the show. Let's begin with our vocabulary section. Newsflash. Newsflash. Wiadomość z ostatniej chwili. Headline. Headline. Nagłówek. Editorial. Editorial. Wstępniak. Anchor. Anchor. Prezenter. Bias. Bias. Stronniczość, uprzedzenie. News. We hate to watch them, don't we? It seems every time you tune in, your heart rate skyrockets. Why? Because, according to the news, everything sucks. Bad news catch our attention more than news about something going on well. I would say it's in our nature. Bad news invokes stronger emotions. We equal bad news to danger. You are more attentive in a dangerous situation. We take bad news personally. For news outlets, it means better ratings and, in turn, more money. Good news are few and far between. Scientific breakthroughs happen once in a blue moon. Award ceremonies take place more often, but still they are annual events. You get to see one once a year. Sporting events are frequent, but they don't always bear good news. What about weather reports? Well, unless you're a farmer, they're completely subjective. Our social studies professors liked to stress the importance of watching the news. Yours might have said something similar to what mine uttered. Watching the news is like living through historical events, or something along these lines. How informed do we need to be, really? How deep and meaningful is our historical experience while watching the news? Let's take the Second World War, for example. It's probably the most well-documented event in our history. Imagine you are a French dairy farmer in the 40s. How often would you get any news? You don't buy a newspaper every day, since a bicycle ride to the nearest town would take you half a day. About 4 million French owned a radio receiver, which makes it 10% of the population at the time. I find it doubtful many dairy farmers would have had a radio. Even if you had one, would you have time to listen to it? After all, cows won't milk themselves. It's a safe bet that there were also other groups living in remote areas of the world, unaware that there was a war going on, until soldiers came knocking on your door. There were also several known cases of people going into hiding while the war was going on. Some of them had done such a good job that they were unaware that the war was over for decades. Check out your podcast notes. You'll find a link to an article about 2 Japanese men who had been hiding for 60 more years after the conclusion of the Second World War. Nowadays, information is readily available to everyone. A little bit of typing, a few mouse clicks, a swipe of the screen, and you've got the world at your fingertips. Accessibility of news sharply rose over the past few decades. I found myself wondering how much of information we consume relates directly to our lives. News outlets like to present any event as personal and life-changing. Again, it increases the ratings. That's how they make money, mostly. How much information we digest is that important in reality? Over the last month, I conducted an experiment. I decided to skip reading, watching, or listening to the news for the next 30 days or so. I made 2 exceptions to my no news rule, just so people around me don't take me for a lunatic. Rule number 1, second-hand news are fine. Second-hand information is information you get from a source different than the original, which makes it less reliable. Instead of watching a press conference on tax reform, you'd listen to your dad, raving at the government for trying to slip in additional taxes without digging much into the matter. If someone wants to share some news with me, I naturally won't shut them down. Rule number 2, I don't expect anyone to follow the rules I made for myself. If someone else is watching the news in the same room, I won't ask them to change the channel. I'll just treat it as background noise, static. The point of this experiment is to refrain myself from actively seeking out news, not to make others change their habits to my liking. Before I started my no news adventure, I made a mental note of the most important ongoing events. These topics also happen to be the most popular in any news outlet. These include economic situation, namely interest rate, inflation, currency rates, any ongoing armed conflicts, domestic political situation, and sports. Here are my observations after a month of news deprivation. Economic situation still sucks. I didn't have to follow a chart or listen to experts. All I needed to do is go shopping or browse my payment history. Political situation also remains mostly unchanged. Both sides of political spectrum still jump at each other's throats at any occasion. No changes there. The right wing hates the left wing, and both hate people who choose not to side with one or the other. All armed conflicts in the world are still ongoing and unresolved. Rarely do wars end in 30 days. In sports news, Iga Świątek is still on a winning streak, which also means that everyone is a tennis fanboy these days. Second-hand news are just as biased as regular news. You can hear the same news from 2 different people and you would get something which sounds like 2 different stories, also known as a spin, if I remember correctly from my internship at the local TV station. With that in mind, getting news secondhand gives you an incentive to do diligent research on a particular topic, which I started doing more often after the experiment, and make up your own mind about what you hear. However, it takes a lot of time to educate yourself sufficiently on the topics covered by the news. So you need to pick and choose. Most importantly, I feel less anxious about events that have less influence on my life than advertised by television. News outlets preach to the choir. What they do is tailor information in such a way that it's equivalent to your viewpoints. Targeted news to get more views. Regardless of the way news lean towards, news outlets create an information bubble. Your opinions are reinforced in the bubble while at the same time it protects you from having your views challenged. News are great for one thing, however: learning English. For starters, news anchors have perfect pronunciation. There's a reason why such a pronunciation is called BBC English. If you want to practice, the best way is to mock anchors. Repeat what they say in a ridiculously pronounced fashion. That's how I did it. Let's try it together. A radioactive capsule was found on the side of a road in Australia. Secondly, it's a good opportunity to practice passive voice, as most news are presented using it. To give you a brief rundown, the subject trades places with the object, and the main verb is preceded by be in a particular tense. What's the point of passive voice? The object, in case of news it's usually an event, might be more important than the subject, the person taking part in an event, in a particular context. Also, the subject might be obvious and, in that case, can be easily omitted. This sentence is written in active voice. A reckless driver caused a multiple vehicle collision. A reckless driver is the subject and multiple vehicle collision is the object. The news anchor would present this accident in passive voice. Let's listen to the same sentence in passive voice. A multiple vehicle collision was caused by a reckless driver. What's different? We changed 3 things. 1. We switched places between the subject and the object. We added be in past tense. Finally, the main verb, in that case cause, is in the past participle form, the final verb form. Each verb has 3. Now, you might call me ignorant for not following news. I wouldn't blame you. I also wouldn't get offended over it. I don't see it necessarily as a bad thing. In order to focus on matters which are genuinely important and dedicate due time to them, we have to learn to ignore the ones less impactful. Ignorance is bliss, so the saying goes. What information is valuable? What information is worth digesting and passing on? Which pieces of information should you ignore? Check out your podcast notes. You will find a link to an article on strategic ignorance, why the right kind of ignorance is good for you. You don't have to check news several times a day as I used to. It's a waste of time. The world doesn't change as fast as news outlets would lead you to believe. News are a bit like sugar. The more we consume it, the more we crave for it. However, opposite to sugar, this poison isn't sweet. How can you find satisfaction in believing that the world is being flushed down the toilet? There's no use in getting worked up over events we have very little influence over. If you feel like you are overloaded with information and it's causing anxiety, stress, or worry, take a break. Take a few days to clear your head. Believe me, if the world was about to end, you would know it without watching the news. It's time to revise the vocabulary section. It's time to revise vocabulary. I will give you an example sentence for each word. For translations, check out your podcast notes. You will hear each sentence twice. Let's begin. Newsflash. Newsflash. Wiadomość z ostatniej chwili. We interrupt this program to bring you a newsflash. We interrupt this program to bring you a newsflash. Headline. Headline. Nagłówek. Big and loud headlines are trademarks of tabloid journalism. Big and loud headlines are trademarks of tabloid journalism. Editorial. Editorial. Wstępniak. His editorial sparked outrage. His editorial sparked outrage. Anchor. Anchor. Prezenter prowadzący wiadomości. News anchors have to remain collected even when reporting funny news. News anchors have to remain collected even when reporting funny news. Bias. Bias. Uprzedzenie. When reporting, a journalist should be free from bias. When reporting, a journalist should be free from bias. When reporting, a journalist should be free from bias.
Alright, that's it for today's episode. Be sure to follow me on Spotify. It really helps me reach more people with my content. Remember to subscribe to my newsletter to get notified of new episodes. If you have any questions or you just want to say hi, contact me at my email angielskiskonradem@gmail.com.